All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we've got a fascinating one for you.
Yes, we do.
We're diving into a transcript, a pretty lengthy one, of a lecture and Q&A session. It's by Dr. Zakir Naik, and the title kind of says it all. Quran and Modern Science, Compatible or Incompatible?
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is. And you shared this with me. I know you're always fascinated by those points where different fields of knowledge seem to intersect, like where you
Hmm.
get these aha moments.
Absolutely. Those are the best.
So, with this deep dive, our mission is to really pull out the most compelling connections that Dr. Naik draws between the Quran, which was revealed over 1400 years ago, and what modern science tells us today.
That's right.
Okay, so for those who might not know, who is Dr. Zakir Naik?
Well, Dr. Zakir Naik is a medical doctor by training.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but he's actually much better known internationally as a speaker on Islam and comparative religion.
Okay.
He's the president of the Islamic Research Foundation, and he's got a very specific way of presenting his arguments. He uses the Quran, of course, but also authentic hadith, which are the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, and he weaves in reason, logic, and scientific facts to clarify Islamic viewpoints and address any misconceptions.
That's quite a combination. He's like a scholar and a scientist rolled into one.
That's one way to put it.
Has he had a wide reach?
No, absolutely. I mean, Dr. Naik has given over 1,000 public talks globally, and he's been in dialogues with leaders, scholars from many different faiths.
Wow.
And it's also worth noting that he was actually recognized for his work in dawah.
Now, what's dawa?
It means essentially inviting people to Islam, and for his work in comparative religion by Sheikh Ahmed Deedat. Now, Sheikh
Okay.
Deedat himself was an extremely influential speaker in these fields, so it's, high praise.
Definitely.
Okay, so getting back to the central question of this whole deep dive, it's the question that Dr. Naik himself asks, right?
Hmm.
Is the Quran compatible with modern science or not? Exactly. Right at the beginning, he makes a point that I think is really important for framing our discussion.
Well,
He says, the Quran, it's not a textbook, a science textbook in the way we understand it.
right.
He calls it a book of signs, or ayats in Arabic. And there are over 6,000 of these signs in the Quran, and over 1,000 of them actually relate to science.
Okay, that's a significant number.
It is.
And so he's looking at those specific signs, and he makes it clear that we're going to be focusing on established scientific facts.
That's right, not theories or hypotheses, things that are generally accepted as true by the scientific community.
All right, so let's start at the very beginning, literally, with cosmology.
Okay.
One of the first topics Dr. Naik brings up is the Big Bang Theory, which is, pretty much the widely accepted explanation for how the universe began.
Right.
And he actually mentions that the scientists who helped develop this theory received a Nobel Prize for it back in 1973, so it's a pretty big deal.
Absolutely.
But here's the interesting part. He points to a verse in the Quran, Surah Anbiya, chapter 21, verse 30, which talks about how the heavens and the earth were once joined together.
Oh, wow.
And then they were split apart.
Like, that's essentially the Big Bang, right?
Right, like that core idea of an initial unified state and then this massive expansion it's captured in that verse.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, it makes you wonder how something so fundamental to cosmology could be alluded to in a text that's so old.
It is. It's really striking.
Yeah.
Then he moves on to talk about the initial state of the universe.
Okay.
He brings up Surah Fusilat, chapter 41, verse 11, which mentions the sky being like smoke. The word used is dukhan in Arabic.
Smoke. That's a pretty vivid image.
It is. And what Dr. Naik points out is that scientists now believe the early universe was made up of this super hot, dense matter, mostly in a gaseous form.
Right.
But he suggests that dukhan, which means smoke specifically, might actually be a more accurate way to describe that early state than just the general term gas.
So he's focusing on the specific word choice.
Exactly. Gas is accurate, sure, but smoke has these connotations of intense heat and those tiny particles of matter.
I see his point. It's like the language itself is hinting at a more precise understanding of the conditions.
That's how he presents it.
Interesting.
So, moving on from cosmology, let's look at some of the points he makes about astronomy.
Okay.
One of the things that's really interesting is how he talks about the shape of the Earth. We all know the Earth is round now,
Right.
but he reminds us that it wasn't that long ago, historically speaking, that people believed the Earth was flat. It wasn't until Magellan's voyage in the 16th century that it was definitively proven through circumnavigation.
Yeah, that's true.
But Dr. Naik points out that centuries before that, the Quran, in Surah Luqman 31.29 and Surah Az-Zumar 39.5 describes this merging, this overlapping or coiling. The word is takwir in Arabic of night and day.
Coiling. What does that have to do with the shape of the Earth?
He argues that this gradual transition from day to night and then back again wouldn't happen on a flat Earth. You'd have the sudden shift, right?
That makes sense.
But on a sphere, as it rotates, you get that gradual change, that coiling effect as the day wraps into night and then unwraps back into day.
Oh, I see. It's like wrapping a turban around your head, that kind of imagery.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop at just spherical.
He doesn't.
No, he brings up Surah An-Naziat 79.3 way, which uses the word daha. Now, daha can mean expanse, but it's also connected to the word duhia, which specifically refers to an ostrich egg.
An ostrich egg. Okay, now that's specific.
Very specific. And Dr. Naik connects this to the fact that the Earth isn't perfectly round, right? It's slightly flattened at the poles and bulges a bit at the equator.
Oh, like an ostrich egg.
Exactly. And that wasn't something that was widely known at the time the Quran was revealed.
It was a really interesting connection.
It is. Then he delves into the nature of light from different celestial bodies. He contrasts the light of the sun, which is shams in Arabic, and is described using words like siraj or wahaj, which mean it has its own light, like a blazing lamp.
Right. The sun is our primary light source.
Exactly. But when he talks about the moon, qamar, in Arabic, the words used are nur or munir, which mean borrowed or reflected light.
So the Quran was already saying the moon doesn't produce its own light.
That's what he suggests. He points to Surah Al-Furqan 25.61, Surah Yunus 10.5, and Surah Nu 71.1516 to support this.
That's remarkable, considering that for centuries people weren't sure about the source of the moon's light.
It really is. And he even talks about the light of stars, Naj in Arabic, describing it as thakib, which implies this kind of piercing quality that weakens with distance.
Oh, like how starlight seems to twinkle and fade the farther away the stars are?
Exactly. It's like the Quran was already hinting at those vast distances and the way light travels across them.
Wow.
Then he gets into the whole debate about how celestial bodies move.
Oh, the geocentric versus heliocentric model.
Exactly. He touches on how people used to think everything revolved around the Earth, and then Copernicus and Kepler came along and put the sun at the center.
Right, right.
But what he highlights is Surah Anbiya 21.33, which states that both the sun and the moon are traveling in orbit with their own motion. The word used is yazbahun, which implies not just orbiting, but also spinning.
So rotation.
Yes. And we know now that the sun does rotate. It takes about 25 days.
It's amazing how that level of detail is there in the Quran.
It's pretty striking, right?
Yeah.
And he continues talking about orbits and paths, citing Surah Yasin 36.4, which says the sun can't overtake the moon and night and day don't clash. They're each moving in their own lane.
Their own orbits. So like a clear understanding that they have separate and predictable paths.
That's how he interprets it.
Makes sense.
And he even brings up this idea of the sun having a finite lifespan. He refers to Surah Yasin 36.38, which describes the sun running its course to a determined place. The word for that is mustaqar.
Okay.
And he links this to the concept of the solar apex.
Now what's that?
It's basically the direction in the constellation Hercules that our sun is traveling towards, and eventually its nuclear fusion will end.
So the sun is on a journey with a destination, and the Quran mentioned it.
That's how Dr. Naik interprets it.
It's fascinating how these ancient texts can align with what we're discovering now.
It is. It's mind-blowing. So another interesting point he raises is about the interstellar medium.
Okay, the stuff between stars.
Yeah, that's it. So for a long time, people thought space was a complete vacuum, empty. But now we know that there's actually stuff out there. Dust, gas, plasma.
Plasma, like what we see in those fancy TVs.
Well, not exactly, but it is ionized gas, yeah.
Okay.
And Dr. Naik connects this to Surah Al-Furqan 25.59, which says, Allah created the heavens and the earth and what is between them.
So he's saying that what is between them could refer to that interstellar medium.
That's his interpretation. And it makes sense, right? Because if space was truly empty, there wouldn't be anything between.
It's a very literal reading, but
Yeah.
it does make you think.
Right. Then he talks about the atmosphere, our atmosphere, as a form of protection.
Oh, like how it shields us from all that harmful radiation from space.
Exactly. And he links this to Surah Al-Anbiya 21.32, which describes the sky as a protected ceiling.
A protected ceiling. That's such a beautiful way to describe it.
It is.
Yeah.
And finally, in his section on cosmology and astronomy, he talks about the expanding universe.
Ah, Edwin Hubble and his big discovery.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, back in 1925, Hubble observed that galaxies are moving away from each other, which led to this revolutionary idea that the universe is actually expanding.
Right.
And Dr. Naik connects this to Surah Ad-Dariyat 51.47, where the word muziun is used. It can mean vastness, but it also carries the sense of expansion.
Wow, so the Quran was talking about the universe expanding way before Hubble.
That's what he suggests. And he even quotes Stephen Hawking, who said that the discovery of the expanding universe was one of the greatest intellectual revolutions of the 20th century.
It is huge, yeah.
So it's a pretty bold claim.
Definitely.
All right, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about some of the points Dr. Naik makes about physics.
Okay.
He starts by bringing up the ancient Greeks, specifically Democritus and his idea of atomism.
Oh, like the idea that everything is made up of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms?
That's it. And he mentions the Arabic word for atom, which is dura.
Okay.
But then he goes on to cite Surah Saba 34.3 and Surah Yunus 10.61, which state that Allah knows every single detail of an atom and that nothing, no matter how small or large, escapes his knowledge.
So he's making a connection between the Quran's emphasis on Allah's all-encompassing knowledge and the idea of atoms as these fundamental building blocks.
Exactly. Like the Quran was already acknowledging a level of detail beyond what people could observe back then.
I see. It's like a hint at this whole world of subatomic particles and the fundamental nature of matter.
Right. It's pretty profound when you think about it.
It is.
Okay, so now let's dive into the world of water, specifically hydrology.
Hydrology. That's the study of water, right?
Right, yep. And Dr. Naik talks about how our understanding of the water cycle, how water evaporates, forms clouds, rains, and so on, wasn't really well established until the 16th century.
Oh, right.
A guy named Bernard Palissy gets credit for that.
Okay.
But Dr. Naik points out that the Quran, centuries before that, was already describing many aspects of the water cycle.
Really?
Yeah, he brings up a whole bunch of verses, like Surah Az-Zumar 39.21, which talks about water from the sky going into the ground and causing springs, and Surah Ar-Rum 30.24, which describes rain reviving the dead earth.
Wow, those are pretty accurate descriptions of how the water cycle works.
Exactly. He also mentions Surah Al-Hijr 15.22, which talks about these fertilizing winds called lawaki.
Fertilizing winds.
Yeah, it's thought that this could refer to winds carrying moisture, which is essential for plant growth.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there are verses like Surah An-Nur 24.43 and Surah Ar-Rum 30.48 that describe how clouds form and how rain falls. And Surah At-Tariq 86.11, which talks about how water goes up to the sky and then returns back down.
So like a cyclical process.
Exactly. It's amazing how much detail there is about the water cycle in the Quran.
It really is. It's
Good.
clearly a very important element in Islamic thought.
Absolutely. He even mentions Surah An-Nur 24.43 again, where it describes clouds as being like mountains.
Like mountains.
Yeah, he says if you fly above the clouds, they really do look like mountains.
Oh, I guess that's true.
And he lists even more verses that talk about the water cycle. Surah Al-Araf 7.57, Surah Arad 13.1, Surah Al-Furqan 25.48-49, Surah Fatir 35.9, Surah Yasin 36.34, Surah Al-Jathiyah 45.5, Surah Qaf 50.9 to 10, Surah Al-Waqiyah 56.68-70, and Surah An-Nahl 16.9.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is, right?
It really highlights how vital water is to life.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's switch gears again and talk about geology.
Geology. Rocks and stuff.
That's the one. So Dr. Naik starts by talking about the structure of the Earth.
Okay.
You know how we have this thin kind of unstable crust that sits on top of this molten interior?
Right, right.
And he points to Surah An-Naba 78.6-7, which describes mountains as stakes, like tent pegs that have these deep roots.
Interesting.
He also brings up Surah An-Naziat 79.32 and Surah Al-Ghashiyah 88.18. Which talk about how mountains are firmly placed. They're not just sitting on the surface.
So the Quran is emphasizing the role of mountains in stabilizing the earth.
Exactly. He even mentions this geology textbook called The Earth by Frank Press, who was a president of the U.S. Academy of Sciences. And in that book, there are illustrations of mountains with these deep wedge-shaped roots, and it explains how those roots are what help prevent earthquakes.
Oh, wow.
And Dr. Naik connects that back to Surah Al-Anbiya 21.31 and Surah Luqman 31.9, which also talk about mountains and their role in stabilizing the earth.
It's like the Quran was ahead of its time in understanding the geology of mountains.
That's how he presents it.
Pretty amazing.
It is. Okay, so now let's dip our toes into oceanography.
Oceanography.
Yeah, the study of the oceans. So Zakir Naik brings up these verses, Surah Al-Furqan 25.53 and Surah Ar-Rahman 55.1-2020, that describe these two bodies of water. One is fresh and sweet, the other is salty and bitter,
Okay.
and they meet, but they don't mix.
They don't mix.
Nope. The Quran says there's a barrier, or barzakh in Arabic, between them.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and Dr. Naik explains that this describes a real phenomenon that happens in places like where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet at Cape Point, in the Nile Delta, and with the Gulf Stream.
Wait, so there are places where different bodies of water meet but don't fully mix?
Exactly. It's because of differences in things like density, salinity, temperature.
I had no idea.
He even mentions that the famous oceanographer Jacques Cousteau was amazed when he learned about these verses in the Quran.
Wow.
So it's a pretty specific natural phenomenon.
Definitely.
Okay, now let's dive into biology, the study of life.
All right.
Dr. Naik starts with Surah Al-Anbiya 21.30, which states that every living thing is made from water.
Well, yeah, we all know that's important.
But think about it. This verse was revealed in the Arabian Peninsula, a desert environment. So, highlighting water as the basis of all life is pretty profound.
That's true.
He then connects this to the fact that cells are mostly made up of cytoplasm, which is, mostly water, and that living organisms, on average, have a very high water content. He mentions Surah An-Nur 24.45 and Surah Al-Furqan 25.54 to support this.
It's a fundamental biological truth, and the Quran clearly recognized it.
Absolutely. Now, he also touches on botany, which is the study of plants.
Okay.
He brings up a point that might surprise some people. The fact that plants reproduce sexually.
Oh, with male and female parts.
Exactly. Now, we know this now scientifically, but it wasn't always common knowledge.
Right.
And Dr. Naik links this to Surah Taha 20.53, which says Allah creates plants in pairs, azwaj, which can be translated as spouses or mates.
Oh, implying male and female.
Yes. And he also brings up Surah Ard 13.3, which mentions fruits in pairs. He points out that even in cases where a plant might seem to reproduce asexually, like with unisexual flowers or those fruits that develop without fertilization, there are still distinct male and female elements involved.
So the Quran's description of plants in pairs aligns with our modern understanding of plant reproduction.
That's how he sees it.
Fascinating.
Now let's move on to zoology, the study of animals.
Okay.
Dr. Naik starts with Surah Al-An'am 6.38, which describes animals and birds as living in communities just like humans.
Oh, like how ants have colonies and wolves live in packs.
Exactly. And we now know, thanks to science, that animal social structures can be incredibly complex.
They really can?
Then he brings up Surah An-Nahl 16.6869, which talks about bees.
Bees, what about them?
It describes how they build these intricate honeycombs, how they collect nectar from all sorts of plants, and how they navigate these complex paths to find their way back to the hive.
Wow.
And Dr. Naik connects this to the work of Carl von Frisch, who won a Nobel Prize for his research on bee communication.
Oh, yeah, he's the one who discovered the waggle dance, right? How bees communicate with each other.
That's him. And Dr. Naik points out that the Quran uses the female gender when referring to worker bees, which is scientifically accurate.
Oh, that's right. The worker bees are all female. I remember learning that.
But back in the day, people actually thought they were male. He even mentions Shakespeare's Henry IV, where there's a line about the sad-eyed justice, with his surly hum, delivering o'er to executors pale the lazy yawning drone.
So even Shakespeare got it wrong.
Well, science has come a long way.
That's true.
Then he talks about Surah An-Nam 27.1 and 18, which tells the story of Solomon and his army encountering an ant. And the ant warns its fellow ants to get out of the way so they don't get stepped on.
Oh, I remember that story.
And what's interesting is that Dr. Naik connects this to what we know now about ant behavior. How they have this complex social structure with a division of labor, how they bury their dead, how they communicate with each other, and how they even have these marketplaces where they exchange goods.
Ant marketplaces. That's incredible.
It is, right?
Yeah.
He even talks about how they handle stored grain, making sure it dries properly and that it doesn't sprout.
Wow, that's some serious organization for such tiny creatures.
It's amazing. And lastly, in the zoology section, he brings up Surah Al-Ankabut 29.41, which compares people who put their trust in things other than Allah to a spider building its web.
Okay.
And he draws this parallel between the fragility of a spider's web, which can be easily destroyed, and the idea of relying on something that's not ultimately dependable.
I see. It's a metaphor for misplaced trust.
Exactly. And he even mentions how female spiders sometimes kill and eat the males after mating, which adds another layer to that idea of instability.
That's a pretty dark metaphor.
It is, but it's effective.
It is.
Okay, so let's move on to the human body.
Okay.
Dr. Naik compares what the Quran says about blood circulation with what was discovered scientifically much later.
Okay, what does he say?
So it wasn't until the 17th century that William Harvey figured out how blood circulates throughout the body.
Right.
But Dr. Naik points to Surah An-Nahl, 16.66, and Surah Al-Mu'minun, 23.21, which talk about how milk is produced in cattle.
Milk. What does that have to do with blood circulation?
Well, those verses describe how milk comes from a substance that's a mixture of what's in the intestines and blood.
So, like, it's acknowledging a connection between the digestive system, the circulatory system, and milk production.
Exactly. And that was a pretty advanced understanding for the time.
It really was.
Okay, now let's talk about medicine.
Medicine.
Yeah, so Dr. Naik discusses the healing properties of honey.
Honey. I mean, it's good for you, but...
But it wasn't until fairly recently that scientists figured out how bees actually make honey, right?
Right.
And Dr. Naik points to Surah An-Nahl, 16.69, which describes honey as coming from the bellies of bees.
From their bellies.
Yeah, it's a pretty accurate description. And the verse also mentions that honey has different colors and that it contains healing for mankind.
Well, we do know that honey has all sorts of antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties.
Exactly. And Dr. Naik points out some of the specific benefits that science has now confirmed,
Like what?
like its vitamin K and fructose content, how it can be used as a mild antiseptic, even how it might help with allergies.
Interesting. So the Quran was already talking about honey as medicine way back then.
That's what he's suggesting.
Amazing.
Now get ready for this because we're about to dive into embryology.
Embryology, that's the study of how embryos develop, right?
Yep. And Dr. Naik actually spends a lot of time on this topic.
Okay.
He brings up this fascinating story about a leading embryologist named Professor Keith Moore.
Professor Moore, I think I've heard of him.
He's a big name in embryology. And back in the late 1970s, a group of Arab students presented him with some verses from the Quran and Hadith about how embryos develop.
Really? What happened?
Well, Professor Moore was initially skeptical.
I mean, that makes sense.
Right. But as he studied these verses and compared them to what he knew from his own research, he was amazed by how accurate they were. One of the key verses that they discussed was Surah Al-Alaq, 96.1-2, which talks about the creation of humans from alaq.
Alaq.
Yeah, it's an interesting word because it has multiple meanings in Arabic. It can mean something that clings, a leech-like substance, or a blood clot.
Okay.
And Professor Moore was initially unsure about the leech-like description,
Understandably.
but then he looked at an embryo under a microscope and he realized it does actually look like a leech in its earliest stages.
No way.
And then Dr. Naik explains how all three meanings of alaq actually apply to different aspects of the embryo's development. It clings to the uterine wall, it has a leech-like appearance, and there are blood clots present in those early stages.
That's incredible.
It is, right.
Yeah.
Then Dr. Naik moves on to talk about the next stage, the transformation of the alaka into muga.
Oh, God.
It means something like a chewed-like lump. It's mentioned in Surah Al-Mu'minun, 23.13.
Okay.
And Dr. Naik tells a story about how Professor Moore used to demonstrate this stage using a piece of plasticine that he would chew on.
He chewed on plasticine.
Yeah, to show his students how the somites, which are these segments that will eventually become vertebrae, create these bumps on the embryo that look like teeth marks.
Oh, I see. So it was a visual aid.
Exactly.
How creative.
And Dr. Naik points out that the Quran outlines these stages in a very specific order. From nutfa, which is a drop, to alaka, then muga, then the formation of bones, then flesh, and finally a fully formed human being.
And that order is scientifically accurate.
According to Dr. Naik and Professor Moore, it's even more comprehensive and accurate than some of the early scientific classifications.
Wow.
Then Dr. Naik talks about Surah Al-Mu'minun, 23.13 again, where it describes the nutfa being placed in a firmly fixed lodging. And he connects this to how the embryo is protected inside the womb by the spinal column, the back muscles, the abdominal wall, the amniotic sac, the amniotic fluid.
It's like the Quran understood the layers of protection for the developing fetus.
Exactly.
Amazing.
Then he brings up Surah Al-Hajj 22.5, which describes the muga stage as being partly formed and partly unformed.
Partly formed and partly unformed. What does that mean?
Well, Dr. Naik explains that this reflects what scientists have discovered about how embryos develop. There are some cells that are already differentiated, meaning they've started to become specific tissues and organs, but there are also undifferentiated cells that will become other things later on.
So it's like the embryo is in this state of constant development and change.
That's it.
I see.
He also talks about how the Quran describes the development of the senses. Surah As-Sajda 32.9 and Surah Al-Insan 76.2 both mention that hearing develops before sight.
Oh, right. I remember learning that in biology class.
And Dr. Naif points out that this is completely accurate. The inner ear actually starts forming much earlier than the eyes.
Yeah, that's right.
Then he brings up Surah At-Tariq 86.5 to 7, which says humans are created from a drop emitted from between the backbone and the ribs, and he connects this to the development of the reproductive organs. So, in an embryo, the reproductive organs actually start developing near the kidneys, which are located between the spine and the lower ribs, and then they descend to their final position.
Oh, wow.
But they keep their nerve and blood supply from that original location. So the Quran's description is anatomically accurate.
That's pretty remarkable.